When in Canada, Justin Trudeau gets hammered by the legacy media press with questions over dropping poll numbers and his potential resignation. Outside of Canada, things aren't going so well for Justin Trudeau either. This week, our Prime Minister, along with quite a large delegation of Liberal ministers and MPs, are in Washington, D.C. to mark the 75th anniversary of the NATO alliance. And since Canada hasn't reached the NATO defense spending targets of 2% of GDP since the days of Pierre Trudeau, close to 50 years ago, NATO leaders and US representatives have been hammering Justin Trudeau and attacking Trudeau over failing to live up to our commitment. But you see, it's not just NATO world leaders and US politicians attacking Trudeau over this. It's that Canadian legacy media press, back at it again, the press that he's worked so hard to try to buy off in order to guarantee positive coverage, who are also attacking him and his government over failing to live up to their NATO commitments. And it all looks like the pressure has paid off. Bill Blair, earlier today, announced Canada's plan to reach that 2% of GDP, that NATO defense spending target, after years of public pressure. But the question still remains, why has it taken so long for Canada to take this seriously? Why have successive governments failed to spend the necessary amount of money in order to have a functioning military and to protect our country? And on this show, I will be breaking down the numbers and the statistics behind Canada's chronic underfunding of our armed forces, not just under Justin Trudeau, but also under Stephen Harper. Before we do that, however, be sure to drop a like on this video, help us out by subscribing to the True North YouTube channel, and the comment question for the episode is this: is increasing Canada's defense spending a priority for you? Let me know your answer in the comments below, and let's get into it. Well, the hits just keep on coming for Justin Trudeau. As soon as he landed in Washington, D.C. for the 75th anniversary of the NATO alliance, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson accused Canada of shamefully riding on the coattails of American security. Take a listen.
By contrast, shamefully, Canada announced in the last few days, or last couple of days, that they won't be ponying up. They're not going to do their 2%. Why? Well, talk about riding on America's coattails. They have the safety and security of being on our border and not having to worry about that. I think that's shameful. I think if you're going to be a member nation and participant, you need to do your part. Some have a greater sense of urgency about that, clearly.
And the full force of the United States gerontocracy seems to be out for Justin Trudeau as well. Take a listen to the extremely old Mitch McConnell, of all people, once again calling out Canada for not doing our part.
Majority Leader and I and some others met with the Canadian Prime Minister. With all due respect to our Canadian friends, they're a long way from hitting the 2% mark, but a whole lot of the rest of the NATO members have.
And in May, before the conference, Justin Trudeau received a letter from U.S. senators like Mitt Romney and Canadian Ted Cruz calling on the government to increase our defense spending to 2% of GDP. This is what they wrote to the Prime Minister back in May. As we approach the 2024 NATO summit in Washington, D.C., we are concerned and profoundly disappointed that Canada's most recent projection indicated that it will not reach its 2% commitment this decade. In 2029, Canada's defense spending is estimated to rise to just 1.7%, 5 years after the agreed-upon deadline of 2024 and still below the spending baseline. And a report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer just 3 days ago makes it clear that Canada just simply won't reach that target by 2030. Now, this graph shows what the Department of National Defense is projecting to spend and what the Parliamentary Budget Officer believes will actually be spent. And the gap just gets wider and wider. And before the conference actually kicked off, Bill Blair found himself at a foreign policy discussion where he was asked this question directly: why Canada hasn't reached its defense spending targets.
A lot of NATO leaders are in town, and one of the big themes is 2% of GDP for every single country being the floor, not the ceiling, for defense spending. And Canada's is, I think, at about 1.3% and change.
It is at the moment. I introduced a new defense policy update for my government, and with a budget that will see my defense budget rise by 27% next year over this.
My quick math tells me that still takes you to 1.7.
And that's exactly where it takes me. But let me acknowledge too, NATO's right. Every country, member of NATO, has to do more, and we're committed to doing more. We are also committed to the 2% expenditure in GDP. One of the challenges, I think every defense minister, and I get to meet with them all on a regular basis, it's not just a matter of how much you spend, but it's a matter of spending it well and making sure that you can produce real value for our armed forces.
They understand their commitments. They know what needs to be done. They know what they're being asked, but they just won't do it. They just won't spend the money that is required. Now, Justin Trudeau, he knows what he's being asked to do. He knows what needs to be done. He won't do it, of course, but he will get on the podium and talk about how important NATO is to Canada. He will talk about how much more Canada is doing for defense, for the NATO alliance, just not, of course, what is actually required.
We're investing more in our troops, in our capacity, and in our capabilities, all while continuing to provide assistance to our allies resisting Russian aggression. NATO is the strongest military alliance in the world. And to keep it that way, we must continue to step up individually and collectively to strengthen both our alliance and the collective peace it represents and protects. Canada stands with our NATO allies.
But what is Canada actually spending right now on defense as a proportion of our GDP and the actual number, and what would that number need to be to reach 2%? It's all well and good to talk about it, but if we don't know the actual numbers, then what's the point? The Department of National Defense's main estimate on 2023-2024 is $26.5 billion. That is 1.33% of Canada's GDP, placing us as the 7th largest spender on defense in NATO and the 14th largest in the world. Canada, however, stands alone as the only country in NATO without a plan to reach 2% of our GDP on national defense by 2030. Now, in order for Canada to reach our NATO commitment by the next year, we would need to spend $57 billion on defense. Our country would need to double our defense spending, which obviously won't be happening anytime soon. But take a look at this graph, which details how each NATO member country is spending on defense, as not just a proportion of their GDP, but also on the targets regarding equipment. Canada finds itself second lowest on equipment expenditure, only in front of Denmark. And when it comes to Canada's defense spending as a proportion of our GDP, you can find us right near the back of the line. But believe it or not, before Justin Trudeau came to office, Canada actually was spending less than 1% of our GDP on national defense. Justin Trudeau has actually increased defense spending from the years of Stephen Harper. In 2015, Stephen Harper actually cut $5 billion of defense spending in order to achieve a budget surplus. But you see, Justin Trudeau, he sees himself more as a climate prime minister than as, say, maybe a real prime minister with a serious military. Because you see, in Justin Trudeau's eyes, climate change is actually one of the largest national security threats. And that's where he likes to spend our money the most.
Canada and NATO have long recognized an indisputable fact. Climate change is not only an existential environmental threat, but one of the defining security issues of our time.
Remember, the number that Canada needs to reach in order to hit that 2% of GDP target is $57 billion. But under Justin Trudeau, it's important to remember that since 2015, the federal government has spent over $100 billion to fight climate change. $60 billion from 2015 to 2019, and since 2020, a further $50 billion on Canada's green recovery. We know that one of the other targets Canada is not reaching is the target imposed on us to lower our carbon emissions, which we're not at all close to doing. In fact, our carbon emissions just keep rising, despite the fact that the federal government has spent over $100 billion to fight climate change. Now, maybe defense spending is not a priority for you, and I understand that. It's not something that Canadians should even be talking about. It should just be taken care of. It shouldn't be even in the news. But it is. That's the situation that we're in right now. But on a scale of what's more important, is fighting climate change more important, or is having a strong military more important? is having a military that can defend the country without relying on anyone else more important than climate change? I think the majority of Canadians would likely say probably having a strong military is more important. But clearly, that's not the case with this federal government. Now, is there a nuanced conversation to be had about how climate change is impacting the Arctic and what that means for national security? Of course there is. Of course there's a conversation to be had about how to tackle a changing climate in the Arctic, because that obviously is a national security threat. But how do you address that? Do you address that by forcing a carbon tax on Canadians? By shutting down our natural resources industry? By having us rely on unproven energy sources? Forcing us all to drive electric cars? Or do you tackle that problem by investing in the naval equipment that is required to patrol the Arctic? Do you solve that problem by investing in the manpower and resources that we need in order to staff our own ships and to staff our military bases? Canada's situation with national defense is not just a matter of money. We have a crisis of morale. We have a crisis of leadership. No one is signing up to join the forces. We have an attrition crisis. There simply aren't even enough sailors in the Navy to operate all of our ships. Canadian soldiers in Europe training troops who will then go into battle with Russia are having to buy their own helmets and buy their own equipment. The military is now so desperate for troops that we're not even requiring new recruits to be citizens. We're allowing permanent residents to try to apply and join the military. And it was only last year, through Discord leaks of United States military intelligence, that's right, leaks on Discord, that we've found out Trudeau had personally told NATO officials that Canada will never reach the NATO defense spending target. Not just that we will get to it, not that we care about it or whatever, that Canada will never reach the target. And this report is insane. The intelligence report's author stated that Canada's widespread military deficiencies are harming ties with security partners and allies, and that enduring defense shortfalls led the Canadian Armed Forces to assess in February of 2023 that it could not conduct a major operation while simultaneously maintaining its NATO battle group leadership in Latvia and aid to Ukraine. And that without a significant shift in public opinion, this situation wouldn't change. When asked last year about whether or not a Pierre Poilievre government would reach the 2% of GDP spending required by NATO, Pierre Poilievre said that he would work toward it. But remember, this is not just Justin Trudeau. This is the same situation under Stephen Harper, and it has been the same situation under previous Canadian governments. Our country has a very rich military history and a proud military history. Now, I don't like to agree with politicians like Mike Johnson in the United States, but in this situation, I do have to agree with him. I find this to be shameful. Not only should Canada have a functioning military, which it appears we do not have right now, not only should we have a military that is respected by our allies, but every Canadian should want our military to once again be feared by the enemy. Not to be laughed at, not to be looked at as some sort of joke. This is serious business. War is anything but a joke. And that's what the military is supposed to do. Its job is to be able to win wars, to kill the enemy, and to protect the country. It's really that simple when you break it down. But of course, it's anything but when you get into the details. This is shameful, but hardly surprising. All right, that's going to do it for us today on the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Harrison Faulkner, and this is Ratio.